friends. Having studied mythology and sacred symbols for the past 35 years, and more recently cross-referencing them with my 25 years of psycho-somatic and spiritual clinical practice, it has become unambiguously clear to me that we have been given a message from the collective unconscious via these myths and symbols. A message that essentially states that humanity is and always was going to bifurcate into two distinct contingents. One embracing a path towards ever greater wholeness that includes periodic journeys into the unconscious, death as a sacred rite of passage, and life itself as an opportunity to heal and grow the soul. And another that would reject all of this for various reasons. That is, wholly unconcerned with the work of soul, avoids the unconscious and its transformational contents at all costs, and denies death itself as the ultimate rite of passage. This bifurcation, and much, much more, has been stated in many of our most important myths and sacred symbols, specifically the Caduceus, Ouroboros, and staff of Asclepius, as well as instructions for what we can do about it. That includes what the healing and development of the soul actually involves. And in a way, I'm pleased to say, aligns perfectly with the work already being done in therapeutic spaces that are archetypal and hermetic in nature. Why this is so important to many of us at this particular time is obvious. As technology accelerates exponentially, the mainstream world is going to continue to ensnare and exploit the consciousness of those arriving on the earth plane more rapidly and completely than ever before, leading them all into an endlessly superficial Faustian vortex of distraction that really only ever leads to insecurity, meaninglessness, and ultimately despair, and that can only really be remedied with a return to the deep work of soul. So if you are part of that contingent and would like to hear more, I'll hope you'll enjoy the following keynote that I recently made to the Assisi Institute of Archetypal Pattern Analysts that offers a somewhat comprehensive and yet still quite abridged version, or at least a foundation for all of this, that I will continue to elaborate on in future presentations. For the record, it's a little nerdy because it was initially composed in the form of an academic thesis. So I do hope you will forgive me for that and suffer through it anyway. Because if you do, there's a chance that you'll be just as inspired as I have been by this message. Once again, comes to us directly from the collective unconscious. I do hope you enjoy. Thanks for watching. As many of you will know, for Jung and many others, there is no self, no capital S self, without the tension and unification of opposites, all in service of resolving conflict, generating novelty, and offering an ever more fully realized unity. Accordingly, after much research and slog in the annals of antiquity, it seems that the Caduceus may be our very earliest symbol of this notion, comprised of a quaternity of complementary opposites, consisting of two interwoven serpents on the horizontal plane and their ascension from below to above on the vertical, all prefiguring the Christian cross, alchemical rosarium, and Taoist yin yang. Now, in our current time of just intense, fanatical polarization, I really wanted to understand how it was that we came to lose so powerful a connection to this polarity integrating symbol of wholeness that came to us directly from the wisdom of the collective unconscious. And what I discovered in my research was that the collective unconscious apparently predicted this with yet another symbol that harkens back to the meaning of the Caduceus and yet alters it. With the emergence of the myth of Asclepius, ironically one of antiquity's greatest healers, and the symbol of his rod, which bears an unmistakable resemblance to its symbolic predecessor, the Caduceus, I propose that the collective unconscious offered us nothing less than an unspoken proclamation that humanity would bifurcate into two distinct orientations to life. One, embracing a holistic approach to healing and growth, as espoused by the Caduceus and its earlier iteration, the Ouroboros, and a second orientation, as represented by the Rod of Asclepius, representing a more one-sided, partial, atomistic, anti-unconscious, and death-phobic orientation. To begin, however, I'd like to just take a moment to explore the origins of the Caduceus and its central symbol, the serpent. So the Upanishads were the first to formally employ the serpent as a symbol of death and rebirth, relating the shedding of skin to the sloughing off of the mortal coil between lifetimes. Symbologist René Guénon and legendary religious historian Mircea Eliade both agree that for pre-modern, archaic, and traditional peoples, the serpent was the ultimate symbol of life's cyclical birth and death quality. Now, Jung naturally concurs with this, adding that the serpent is a substantiated archetype representing transformation and renewal, but only if we are willing to confront and integrate its more primordial, unconscious, and deserving aspects. One of the most iconic mythological illustrations of this involves the Greek god Apollo, centuries prior to St. George and Beowulf, who was required to defeat the dragon Python, a super serpent, before he was permitted to establish his temple at Delphi that famously bore the inscription, "Know thyself," all of which supports the view that the snake is perhaps the universal symbol of not just unconscious primordial drives, but transformation from one state into another on condition we are able to face them. Now, why then are there two serpents in the Caduceus? Well, as we will see, two is the prima materia of the unification of complementary opposites in that movement towards wholeness. It's a dyadic polarity of two halves that, upon merging with their photographic negative, move towards a totality of wholeness. Now, if we begin to explore the myths associated with the Caduceus, we find them all suffused with this very same notion of polarity integration, the earliest of which appears on a fragment of a terracotta plaque of the Mesopotamian goddess that many of us well know and love, Inanna, who holds a proto-Caduceus dating from 3400 BCE, and who, as we also know, famously descended into the underworld to attend the funeral of the bull of heaven, later slain by Gilgamesh and reincarnated perhaps as the Minotaur overcome by Theseus. Now, in each case, the bull also represents another aspect of those serpent-like instinctual drives, now erupting wild and unbridled, and that must be tamed and transmuted for alignment with the self to take place. The invitation of this inaugural myth is really unequivocally clear. Wholeness emerges only through a union of opposites, from a sovereign, a queen of heaven and earth, war and love, life and death, traveling from the overworld to the underworld, from the conscious to the unconscious, nakedly and without pretense, for the purpose of undergoing a death and rebirth that transforms an otherwise egoic orientation of partiality, we could say, into one aligned with wholeness and the self. Now, 1,000 years later, the Sumerian god Nigin-Shida appears as the second deity bearing the Caduceus in yet another myth suffused with this polarity collapsing symbolism. Now, in the original cuneiform tablets, we are told that Nigin-Shida is guided into the underworld with his sister, Lugal-Kisuna, by a demon, another bull or snake, in order to save the city. Now, their paired descent, while prefiguring later redemptive myths that include Beowulf and Christ, differs because their salvation is achieved not through a single masculine hero, nor solitary feminine heroine, but through an integration of both masculine and feminine, brother and sister. And once again, from overworld to underworld, conscious to unconscious, for the renewal of the kingdom of the self, we could say, to take place. Perhaps you're noticing a theme. The next earliest historical reference to the Caduceus appears in Ovid's Metamorphosis, in which Tiresias, the famous blind prophet of ancient Greece, who Odysseus meets in the underworld, encounters two intertwined snakes on the road. Now, striking one on the head with his staff mysteriously transforms him into a woman for 7 years. Striking the other 7 years later turns him back into a man, once again illustrating the invitation of the Caduceus to integrate polarity, and in this case, very specifically, the masculine and feminine archetypal parts of ourselves. Now, the god Hermes, the primary mythological figure associated with the Caduceus, is also a deity who moves freely between the living and the dead, like Inanna and Niginshida before him. Like Tiresias, he's also an exemplar of the hermaphroditic psyche, because he's no less than its father. For it's the children that Hermes has with Aphrodite, the hermaphrodites, who are the originators of its namesake. The fact that Hermes is also a god of diplomacy and commerce only serves to further amplify his role as the mediating force between two sides that once again reiterates that fundamental symbology of the Caduceus. Now, as an archetypal pattern analyst interested in the objective nature of a symbol, we could say unmolested by purely subjective interpretation, I would propose that there are at least 4 highly compelling natural phenomena that point to the Caduceus's ontological origins and its innate prefigured dynamics that further elaborate its core mandate of polarity integration in service to an ever greater wholeness. Take the following 2 superimposed sine waves that are in sync and that result in a larger amplitude of higher highs and lower lows that is technically referred to as constructive interference, or an increase of interference. Now, this is not what the collective unconscious was pointing to with the Caduceus. On the contrary, the Caduceus is broadcasting the inverse, a pair of sine waves that are out of sync by a half cycle, or what's referred to as pi squared, just like the snakes. The result is something called destructive interference, or a literal destroying of interference. This is what the Caduceus ontologically expresses. Instead of 2 sine waves, snakes, or people for that matter, that make each other's highs higher and each other's lows lower, in nothing less than a manic entanglement that augments interference, static, noise, conflict, it illustrates the inverse, a merging of complementary opposites in which highs are tempered and lows are buoyed in a destruction of interference that literally gives rise to an auditory silence, vibrational stillness, and mathematical zero. Something I personally find fascinating because it provides us with material world evidence for Jung's assertion that unifying opposites is the mediating function for calming upheavals and moral conflicts. Now, the natural phenomenon that perhaps most strikingly resembles the Caduceus is, of course, the DNA double helix. Now, while the archetype expressed through DNA is clearly the code, model, template, seed, and blueprint of life, it's also more than that. At its core, DNA presents us with a very specific dynamical symbolism that not only maintains genomic integrity, but yields genomic novelty and diversity. Unsurprisingly, genes reproduce by pairing complementary opposites and exchanging genetic material in a process that is called chromosomal crossing over, wherein 2 chromosomes will align with one another, exactly like the snakes of the Caduceus, and exchange approximately 10% of their genetic material in service of creating never-before-seen novel variations in life. This crossing over process reflects what Tiresias underwent when he transitioned into the body of a woman, and then back into a man. And what the hermaphroditic father Hermes did by ushering souls into the underworld, as well as what Niginshida and his sister Lugalki-Suna underwent in order to save the city, and what Inanna did in order to be reborn, to say nothing of the epigenetic crossing over that takes place in long-term partnerships, as well as therapeutic containers. This dynamical pattern and message appears to be at the very heart of the Caduceus. It's an invitation to pendulate from one side of life to the other, from masculine to feminine, from overworld to under, as a cardinal prerequisite for the attainment of ever greater wholeness. Now, we have Joseph Campbell to thank for first identifying the Caduceus as an ancient representation of Eastern Kundalini dynamics, which also illustrates its objective reality, dating back to our very earliest spiritual practices within the Hindu culture. Here, the staff represents the spinal column and central line of the Sushumna, while the two snakes represent the Ida and Pingala energy channels that cross 7 times over, reminding us of Inanna, through the chakras until they reach the crown at the top. Kundalini awakening, or transmutation of lower vibrational energies into higher via a synthesis and elevation of the masculine and feminine in each domain, is symbolized by the outstretched wings and expresses that very same invitation from the Caduceus once again to bring our serpent-like aspects into contact with our eagle-like potentials. Incidentally, the very symbol that Friedrich Nietzsche associated with his overman, whose mascot was a snake wrapped around the neck of an eagle in flight, who we are told have become friends. Finally, and I believe most importantly, the natural phenomenon that perhaps most prefigures and embodies the essence of the Caduceus is none other than the torus, a geometric shape that is inferred in the arcing of the snakes up the staff, and that, if continued, traces the idiosyncratic journey of all toroidal objects, from the outside to the inside, from the surface to the center, in yet another primordial pendulation of fundamental polarity that I propose is at the nucleus of the Caduceus's a priori meaning. But what is a torus? Well, according to many, the torus is the most fundamental form of balanced energy flow existing at all scales in the universe. From the microatomic to the macrogalactic, toroidal dynamics are ubiquitous in nature and found in everything from fruit, flowers, trees, to weather patterns. Physiologically, the human heart is also toroidal. Its shape, Leonardo da Vinci first discovered, is not simply designed to pump like a bellows, but to twist and torque like a vortex. Energetically, the heart also produces an electromagnetic field that is well known to be toroidal in nature, as well as the Earth and the Van Allen and Kuiper belts that surround it. And then again at the level of the solar system, heliosphere, Milky Way galaxy, cluster, and supercluster, which all continue to express this very same toroidal pattern at every level of scale, without exception, all of which has led some to posit that reality itself, and I would add the psyche, is a nested, infinitely fractal toroidal lattice. I would invite you all to observe the opening and closing of your own hand to see quite clearly that it has also been designed to move toroidally, and in a shape that appears once again curiously similar to the Caduceus. Now, if we believe that these dynamics were indeed prefigured in the symbol of the Caduceus, then yet another underlying objective mandate emerges from the symbol that is also prefigured in all the previous myths and ontological precedents that we've already covered. For of all the properties of the torus, it exhibits a single, highly unique, dynamical pattern found in no other natural phenomenon. It takes that archetypal journey from its outermost edge into its centermost core and back again in a process that is ongoing and unending. This, I would propose, is the preeminent mandate of the Caduceus, to integrate all polarity, and in so doing embark upon the ultimate archetypal journey of self-devouring and self-rebirthing that is continuous and unceasing. Incidentally, these are precisely the terms used by one of Carl Jung's greatest students, Erich Neumann, in his description of the Ouroboros, which he says slays, weds, and impregnates itself, is self-begetting, self-conceiving, self-devouring, and self-birthing, suggesting that the Ouroboros is also a symbolic rendering of the Torus, as well as the more primal, and I love this, but less elaborate forefather of the Caduceus. This is further supported by Neumann's description of the, quote, circular snake and primal dragon that bites its own tail, is both man and woman, active and passive, above and below, the Alpha and Omega. Precisely what the Caduceus, as a more nuanced iteration of the Ouroboros that now includes that quaternity of opposites, presents. For those that still question whether the Ouroboros is a torus, they need only glance at Neumann's diagram of the ego-self journey, or even the very first picture he chose to begin his Origins and History of Consciousness, that clearly shows the god Vishnu, who by consuming himself creates the world, and in so doing proves himself to be an Ouroboros and a Torus. Naturally, this toroidal journey is also uniquely psychoanalytic, wherein the apple of our own unconscious and shadow that begins in darkness takes the orbital path into the light of awareness, at which point, if we choose to consume it and make conscious, will usher in a transformational death and rebirth process that gives rise to a later iteration of ourselves, one bite at a time. But of course, as we all know, not everyone has such an appetite, which is where the Rod of Asclepius comes in. Now, I'm fully aware that the interpretation I'm going to share with you now runs counter to several hundred years of mythological orthodoxy, and that believes that the symbols of the Caduceus and Rod of Asclepius have absolutely nothing in common, despite the fact that they are identical, save for the rod having only one snake and no wings. Personally, I believe that the rod is unmistakably referential to its predecessor, and that the similarities and differences between them, as generated by the collective unconscious, were not purely coincidental, but pointed, in fact, to that fundamental bifurcation in culture at large. For while the Caduceus emerged first as our earliest quaternity of opposites symbolizing wholeness, I propose that the rod that emerged much later represents merely partiality and one-sidedness as a result of its highly conspicuous dropping of one of its snakes and literal and symbolic clipping of wings. Now, the standard explanation in traditional scholarship for why Asclepius's rod bore only one snake is that it references the serpent that famously swam to the Tiber Island, where the healing temple of Asclepius was divinely ordained to be built. There also exists a second hypothesis for the single snake motif outlined in the Ebers Papyrus, dating from 1500 BC, which describes a treatment for guinea worm, whereby a physician carefully winds the parasite around a stick until it has been fully removed from the patient. Personally, I don't believe that either of these narratives adequately reflects the true dominant of the symbol, let alone the reasons for why the serpent polarity of the Caduceus was somehow superseded by a more lopsided transmission. Indeed, and this is extremely important, the collapse in polarity appears to be expressed as an aberration by the myth of Asclepius itself. For we are told by Homer that as Asclepius's healing powers grew exponentially, or we could say inflate, he began to raise the dead. which the gods found unnatural and disruptive to that delicate balance, or polarity, we could say, between life and death, and for which he was executed by Zeus, suggesting that embracing one-sidedness over wholeness comes with mortal consequences. Now, in our earliest traditions, death was never a failure of medicine, but an essential part of its art. As Mircea Eliade observes in The Sacred and the Profane, this symbolic descent into darkness reenacted the passage into the underworld in which the patient awaited a dream epiphany from the god. The curative power was inseparable from the acceptance that one might not return, and that the ritual death could, in fact, become real. Egyptian temple medicine also wove this same wisdom into its architecture. Indigenous and shamanic traditions also preserved this understanding in their initiations, and the death and birth motif appears perhaps most famously with the dismemberment of King Osiris, whose reassembly gives rise to his rebirth as the sun god Horus. In all of these cases, the healer was not a defier of death, but a midwife to it, guiding the patient from one state to another, from overworld to underworld, like Hermes, Tiresias, Neginshida, Lugalkisuna, Inanna, but not Asclepius. That being said, it should be noted that in the Asclepia of Epidaurus and Cos, incubatio also required patients to surrender to the darkness of the abaton, courting a dream cure while accepting the possibility of no return, suggesting that even as these symbols and myths bifurcated, the practices themselves apparently preserved some echo of the older archetype of the Caduceus. Now, several hundred years after Asclepius's capital punishment, a very interesting thing happens. Hermeticism, and not, we could say, Asclepianism, suddenly appears in the Middle Ages, which, according to Jung, gives rise to our single greatest storehouse of unimpeded symbol formation, and consequently rose to prominence in the Renaissance as one of the dominant medical models of its time that influenced a number of historical figures, including the father of toxicology, Paracelsus. The culmination of Hermeticism took place with the emergence of the second most famous Hermes, Hermes Trismegistus, who was said to be the spiritual heir to Greek Hermes and Egyptian Thoth, and was the author of the two founding Hermetic texts, the Corpus Hermeticum and the Perfect Discourse, both of which were also concerned with the attainment of wholeness, which was stated in unequivocal terms. Hermeticism was about nothing less than the healing of the soul. Now, if we look to these texts for more insight into the relationship between Hermes and Asclepius, and by association, the collective unconscious's intentions for us behind the Caduceus and the Rod, we are immediately struck by the fact that both of these texts involve Hermes in authoritative Socratic dialogue with three of his students, one of whom is none other than Asclepius, the grandson, we are told, of the original Asclepius, which, although a likely literary conceit, immediately suggests that the Asclepian lineage was subservient and is subservient to the Hermetic. In the Corpus Hermeticum, Hermes even reprimands Asclepius repeatedly for being far wandering from the truth or simply asleep. He also clearly reminds him of the core mandate of the Caduceus when he says that, quote, all things are twain, referencing that polarity once again, and that, quote, it is impossible that one should be without the other, and that there are not many but few, and easy to be numbered, for four in all they are, as if speaking directly to the quaternity of opposites that is the Caduceus, and not the asymmetry of the Rod. To that end, Hermes could not have spoken more plainly than if he had told Asclepius to his face, and this young man is why your grandfather was executed, because when he fashioned his rod and single snake, he made 4 into 3 and 2 into 1, and dared to cleave the conjunctio in its oldest symbol of wholeness in half, which is no more possible, we are told, than, quote, to part self from self. An additional detail adds yet more evidence to the rod having hijacked the symbolic significance of the Caducean culture. As you can clearly see, the perfect discourse of Hermes over time, and I can't find a single reasonable explanation for why, had its title mysteriously changed to the Asclepius, a detail that I absolutely believe only further echoes what I'm proposing, that the Caduceus, our oldest symbol representing nothing less than the mysterium conjunctionis, was quietly usurped by the polarizing asymmetry of the rod. For why else would a book be curiously retitled with the moniker of the disciple and not the master? Now let's take a breath and a step back and fast forward into the modern era, only to suddenly find that the allopathic American Medical Association, founded in 1847, has unsurprisingly chosen for its symbolic mascot the Rod of Asclepius, a decision that clearly broadcasted their departure for what had been for millennia a holistic, integrated, conscious and unconscious approach to medicine, in favor of a more materialistic, anti-unconscious, symptom-based, allopathic orientation. For thousands of years, holistic medicine, now suddenly referred to as alternative in the form of Ayurvedic, Chinese, and herbal, had been the dominant approach to healing around the world. This was an archetypally feminine and masculine approach, with an emphasis not just on the physical, but the heart, emotions, energy bodies, and yes, healing of the soul. It was only in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that all this changed, with the advent of germ theory, the invention of the X-ray, electron microscope, and antibiotics. Accordingly, we are now told by any number of publications, medical journals, professionals, and institutions within the medical field that since that time, there's been nothing less than a war waged upon holistic approaches to healthcare by the allopathic, and in my words, Asclepian, single serpented model. A war that focuses on the suppression of symptoms rather than root causes, that is reactive rather than preventative, favors standardized treatments over personalized care, and preferences pharmaceutical drugs and surgery over lifestyle modifications, nutrition, psycho-emotional, somatic, and archetypal interventions. My proposal is that this tectonic shift in medicine was foreshadowed by the collective unconscious when it omitted one of the snakes from the symbol of the Caduceus and transformed it into the rod, and in so doing, undermined an orientation of wholeness that would also include the allopathic, and replaced it with one of partiality that sought to deny the mind-body connection and desacralize the death process. This is the reason I propose that we have such a conflict between these two divergent archetypal approaches to healing and life. For what other reason could there be for the symbols being so consistently misused and mistaken for one another? In a 1992 survey, apparently 76% of US hospitals incorrectly used the caduceus instead of the rod as their symbol of healing, despite the allopathic consensus favoring the rod as the more historically accurate medical symbol. And yet, if 76% persisted in this confusion, does it not suggest an unconscious rejection of the lopsided Asclepian model in favor of the more holistic, hermetic approach? Now, allow me to take a step even further back, beyond medicine, to the ways in which this bifurcation between the two symbols has been reflected in Western civilization writ large. In his seminal work, The Master and His Emissary, Ian McGilchrist describes our current era as being plagued by a breakdown in hemispheric balance. Ring any bells? And the onset, he says, of an excessively left hemispheric orientation to life. According to McGilchrist, around the 6th century BC, incidentally, precisely when the temple of Hermes was built and the Caduceus was most revered, the hemispheres apparently enjoyed a balance in culture. It was only over time that they began to lose their equilibrium in favor of this left hemispheric dominance that, in the words of McGilchrist, is reductive, mechanistic, driven by categories and rule-based thinking, that is narrow, sharply focused, detail-obsessed, fixed, static, isolated, decontextualized, explicit, and general in nature, but ultimately lifeless. The right hemisphere, according to McGilchrist, which I propose symbolizes the snake that was dropped by Asclepius, yields, by contrast, a world of individual, changing, evolving, interconnected, implicit, incarnate, living beings within the context of a lived world. It's the difference between the map and the territory, and a Machiavellian approach to life versus an Erasmian, a theory that McGilchrist himself admits was anticipated long before him, with Pascal, Spinoza, Kant, Goethe, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche, all of whom believed that there were two fundamentally distinct ways in which to approach the world that required integration if wholeness was to be achieved. Stephen Jenkinson, author of Die Wise and spiritual heir to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, has also identified this precise pathology in end-of-life care and in our current cultural approach to death and dying. He states that overarchingly we are in the grips of a cultural death phobia that I would extend to a phobia of the unconscious, and that results in a, quote, end of life without ending, so that we are, quote, gone without any leaving. Precisely what I propose began with Asclepius, who by raising the dead appointed himself as humanity's original death denier. In the documentary Grief Walker, Jenkinson tells a poignant story of a, quote, child that was dying. The only question was when. She was bleeding every few days and was living from transfusion to transfusion. And when I asked the doctors the question, why are you transfusing her? They didn't have an answer. They didn't know what to say because the transfusions were keeping her alive. But in order to do what? In order to have the next transfusion. This is called hell, medically speaking, says Jenkinson. The child should have died a long time ago, but we have the technology, and so she's not. She is now officially on the list of people not allowed to die, in precisely the tradition that began with Asclepius. This is the result of the death phobia, which I propose Asclepius inaugurated when he palliated his patients from having to enter the underworld, the unconscious, and face death as the ultimate completion of life, and for which he was executed. According to the myth, this is the crime of any physician, whether of the body, mind, or spirit, who sees pain and reflexively says, I will take it from you, not because it's right, but because I can, to alleviate you, and perhaps me too, from having to face it, and in so doing, walk the ancient conjunctio path through it. In conclusion, to become increasingly whole is always healing. But to heal, at least in the modern world, no longer necessarily brings about wholeness. This, I propose, is the difference between Hermes and Asclepius, and at the core of Jung's notion of the self. For it is the Caduceus and not the rod that invites us to perpetually oscillate between polarities, to devour and rebirth ourselves in an ongoing annealing of the ego, which strengthens it for the Herculean task of bearing ever greater amounts of our unconsciousness. Now, I'm not suggesting that the collective unconscious via these symbols was passing judgment upon either path, but simply that it has produced them as a mirror of where humanity would fundamentally bifurcate, with some of us embracing the toroidal path of wholeness, as symbolized by the Ouroboros and Caduceus, in which we travel that archetypal orbit into our unconscious and out again in a death and rebirth process that is never ending, while others embrace the path of partiality and the rod and never go inward, never enter the underworld, deny even its very existence, and in so doing, reject our most ancient initiatory journey that has long been lost in modern culture, but that I'm happy to say we are nonetheless slowly returning to in communities such as this. Thank you.